And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner, as always. Today, super excited to be joined by one of my favorite writers in the whole world, and someone that it's been such a joy and pleasure to get to know over the last few years. Peter Swanson joins us today. He has a brand new novella that just released last week. It's called The Christmas Guest, and for a short read, it is awfully punchy, awfully immersive, if you can believe that from a story this dense and compact. But what a fun story it is! Welcome back to the show, Peter.
Thanks, Hank, and thanks for your kind words.
Absolutely. It's absolutely the truth. I've followed your career um since your first or second book was published, and
I think it
I
was my
always
first book.
know. I'm sorry.
I think it was my first book. I feel like we did a podcast for A Girl with a Clock for a Heart
I
many years
feel
ago.
like we did too. It might have been The Kind Worth Killing, and we talked about the girl with a clock for a
Well,
heart.
that's possible too. Yeah,
It was so close there, and I feel like we've done one every year since.
yeah.
But when I saw that you had a Christmas novella out this year, I was pleasantly surprised. Surprised because this is not something I expected from you. Yet when I got it in hand and opened the book and got into it, I think I read this in one sitting, honestly, and I was just like, this is absolutely a Peter Swanson book, and um, what an amazing book it is. When did the idea for this story first come to you?
So this is an interesting story because this book, I mean, what it was basically, well, sort of commissioned, I guess, is the
Okay.
word. But my UK editor and my UK publishing house's favor. So my UK editor over there, um, like, asked if I had any interest in doing a kind of a Christmas thing. Um, and they've done a number in the past few years. They did a few with PD James. They had some posthumous stories of hers. They did John Banville's Snow. They had a lot of success with them. So he was like, "Do you want to do it?" And he kind of said, "It's an opportunity for you to do something a little different." He goes, "You can go cozier if you want. You can go historical. You can write a much shorter novel." Um, and I was instantly interested. I think I was more excited about the possibility of writing a novella, 100-page story than I was writing a Christmas story. But I had an idea, and then I went through my agent and we pitched it to my US publisher. And my editor at the time was kind of like, "I don't understand what you're asking. Like, what do you mean a Christmas thriller? Is this your next book? Is it gonna be a like, he just didn't get it. And, and I think the reason for that is because I think in the UK culture, there's just a lot more, Christmas specials. Do you know what I mean? Like with TV
Yeah.
shows, sitcoms, Doctor Who, there's just a lot more of that. And in fact, they do a Christmas ghost story every year on television. Um, so anyway,
I,
and
I feel
little,
like that used to be more of a thing here in the U.S. I remember growing up in the '80s, and every show would have a Christmas special. It just seems like that's not the case anymore. I wonder what the
I think
difference is
maybe
there.
it just got taken completely over by like Hallmark movies, which have
True.
become the go-to. I mean, there's obviously about 40 new ones a year in
Right.
that genre, but there isn't a ton of like Christmas mysteries or Christmas thrillers or things like that,
Yeah.
along those lines. But anyway, so my American publisher wasn't really interested in it, and it kind of stalled. And then I think it was 2 years ago, during actually around Christmas, that I said, "Well, I'm just going to write it. I have this idea. I think it'll be about 100 pages. So I just wrote it, sent it, and when my UK editor saw it, he bought it, and then my US editor ended up buying it as well, and saying, they were kind of like, well, we'll see how this does, but so I was pretty thrilled. I mean, at one point I thought it would just go to the UK, but I was glad it wound up over here, and it turned out to be I love the novella.
Yeah, yeah. And
Form.
yeah, speaking of the form of the Christmas story, the Christmas novella or whatever, there are certain subgenres that is a completely normal thing. Cozy mysteries, and we're talking about the pure cozy mysteries. There, it's it's not a surprise at all to see a Christmas themed book, an Easter themed book, a Thanksgiving theme. That's it's kind of part and parcel for that subgenre. Um, what do you think it is about the typical thriller genre that is not as open to the special theme stories? Do you think that in their thinking that a Christmas story will kind of limit the exposure the book will get? Do you have any insight into like the industry side of the trepidation?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about your platforms and like how. I mean, I don't know too much about it, but I think in in the UK, built into say the bookstores, Waterstones and WH Smith, they'll put out like you know um, Christmas themed books that run the gamut. I think they're just more used to that, whereas I think in the US, Christmas themed books tend to be romance.
Yeah,
Um, and cozy mysteries, and I think that's the other thing is, I mean, it makes sense that cozy mysteries could be thematically holiday based. I mean, especially Christmas, which is a cozy holiday. I mean, if you
right.
think of like a country house and snow outside and fireplace inside, you're instantly in cozy realm. I think what's funny is that part of me, and I wanted to have those tropes in my book, but part of me was like, oh, maybe I'll make this a little cozier than my normal books, and you've read it, and it's really not cozy at all. Um,
Right.
and I think that's just who I am. It's like you try. So I wouldn't have, it wound up being quite dark, which
Yeah.
is generally where I go.
It's kind of anti-cozy in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no blood splattering everywhere, but it definitely leans kind of more creepy,
it
if we
does.
can use that term.
Yeah.
Um, what about the form of the novella? One of my favorite writers and someone that I studied a lot when I was first starting to write was Ray Bradbury, and he talked a lot about writing short stories, and he was a big advocate of when you're learning to write to write a short story every week. Um,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
edit it, and the logic being, well, surely you can't write 50 bad stories in a row, if you do
You're
this
right.
for a year, which is, kind
One
of
of the
tongue in
most
cheek, but there's something to working out those muscles. And now there's not a lot of places to sell short stories. A lot of the literary journals and things that used to buy those are not really a thing anymore, and so that form is kind of dwindling just because there's no way to make money at it anymore.
right.
And then the novel and the typical one novel per year, from an author is kind of has become standard, and we kind of look for these rhythms in publishing. And then the novella is somewhere kind of in between. How has publishing responded to this form of story, and do you feel like this is, I know this is a one-off for you, and something that you kind of wedged into your normal production schedule, but do you feel like that if you had more ideas for novellas that this could be a thing that you make part of your career?
I could only hope and dream, but I mean, honestly, and you're absolutely right. The short story has gone down. I mean, the short story used to be a very lucrative
Yeah.
business for writers. In some cases, I mean, there were writers who built entire careers out of short stories. John Cheever,
Yeah.
Updike, practically. I mean, lots, but the Cornell Woolrich. Um, but there's not a market for them. So there is a little bit of a market for short stories. There's very little market for novellas, and which I think is a shame because just personally, I think there's a ton of things you can do in the novella length that can work great, especially with like a creepy story. Sometimes your creepy story is not that complex. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't have something that happened 20 years ago that's causing it that you have to delve into. It doesn't need multiple points of view. Maybe it's just someone, arriving in an Airbnb and the neighbor comes over and it's this like creepy thing going on and it's got to get resolved.
Yeah.
Um, and you can't make a novel out of that. I mean, it's too, you can't get your 80,000 words. So I just think novella, there's a lot of possibilities. Um, I would love to do, I mean, um, if we talk about modern novellas, the only person who really is doing it with success, and that's because he can kind of do it whatever he wants, is Stephen King. And
Yeah.
Stephen King's a really good novella writer. I actually think it's like, I mean, sometimes I feel like his books sprawl too much.
Yeah.
Um, and his novellas are probably the length of some people's books, but they're great. It tightens him up, and he's been able to do this thing where he publishes them in usually in groups of four. Um, so I'd love to do that kind of thing, have like, a three novella book, but I, I'm not sure they really sell. I think that's the issue. I mean, Stephen King sells because he's Stephen King, and he
Right.
could obviously publish, his laundry list and he'd sell. But I do think I think it's a really I think it's a great length for mysteries. I wish there were more of them out there, and I definitely have some ideas for a few more.
Stephen King has famously had difficulties with endings sometimes, so much so that he made fun of himself in one of the latest It movies. Maybe it was the second part. I can't remember.
Uh-huh.
Where he plays the shopkeeper and he's selling one of his books and he says, "Oh, the endings are crap," or
Oh,
something
that's
like
right.
that.
I
Yeah,
remember that. That was funny.
Y- yeah, and poking fun at him at himself. But you're absolutely right. The novella is it? Do you think it's because you can conceptually hold the story in your head? Kind of all in one form. Whether you're an outliner, a planner, a pantser, wherever you fall on that spectrum, the novella you can pretty much hold the the totality of the story in your head. Do you think that due to that fact, the form lends toward tighter stories, more that that each scene carries more punch. What do you think that the form of the novella brings to the writing of it?
I think, I mean, it maybe has partly to do with an author keeping their focus. I think, um, and this is sort of a bugaboo of mine, but
Yeah.
the current expected length of a thriller is minimum of sort of 70,000 words, but more closer to 80 or 90,000 words.
Right.
Now, that didn't used to be the case. There's lots of pulp writers and golden age writers. I mean, Agatha Christie, I think and then there were none as 55,000 words. And she kills 10 people. Um,
Right.
but I think if I had a 55,000 word novel now, I think my publishing houses would ask for a bigger book. So what that does is it puts sort of this weird added pressure on the thriller writer. I mean, we all know what it's like. You read a great premise, something creepy happens, maybe a murder occurs, and your interest is perked, and then there's a long middle section where the story kind of sags, and you can almost feel sometimes when the author's stretching, and I'm including myself in this too. I mean, I think you're kind of trying to come up with subplots, you're kind of trying to maintain the suspense before you get to the big finish where you're kind of resolving and tying stuff up. um, so sometimes what it forces you to do is, subplot or bring in different perspectives or add a romance or something. Whereas in a novella, you can kind of just full steam ahead. Um, and tell your story. I guess the short version of what I'm trying to say is not all thriller ideas um, are 300 pages. Probably a lot of
Right.
thriller ideas are um, can be a great 150 pages. And the fact that we have this idea of what a novel is lends itself to some some books that don't quite work.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned that the Christmas Guest is a creepy story, and this is um I don't want to say it's out of character for you because it's not. This book absolutely reads like a Peter Swanson book, but there is a difference in this book and say um one of my all-time favorite books, Eight Perfect Murders. For you, there's as the title suggests, there's lots of there's lots of murder and mayhem in this book, but it's not. I wouldn't call it a creepy book. Um, how you can have murders happen and it not freak you out is
Yeah.
maybe says more about me than anything. But that there's a tone difference in the Christmas Guest as opposed to your other work. Um, how would you describe it?
Um, Well, I think the first thing is, again, and I felt a little freer to do. I'm doing something. It's set primarily in 1989, or at least a section of it is. A section of it is told through diary entries of an American college girl who's studying in London for the year and doesn't go home over her Christmas break and goes instead to a friend's house, an English friend's house. So I get to set it in the Cotswolds in the English countryside. I wanted to make sure it kind of dripped with Christmas trimmings. Um, and what's since I'm telling this portion through her, she was all sort of excited, but then she's sort of noticing that there's something rotten in the heart of Christmas there. So she's sort of wondering what kind of place or story she stumbled into. But the but because it was sort of this one off, I felt, I think, freer to do this different time, to do this a little different tonally. But then I had a backstory all along of what is actually her reason for being there. Um, and I think the book ultimately, I'm not sure I knew this at the beginning, but the book ultimately ended up being about the dark side, the real dark side of Christmas, which is Christmas is causes us to flood with memories because every Christmas is the same. It's the same songs. It's the same smell of the tree. All that stuff brings us back to the Christmases of our childhood. That can be
Right.
a really happy thing, but it can also be a dark thing if in your past um, you had dark Christmases. Then it sticks with you because every year is a reminder. And then ultimately, that's what the book became about.
One thing that I have really studied your books for, Peter, is the way you write um, the beginnings of stories. Your first couple of chapters are always um, stunning in the execution. You really hook us as readers in the beginning, so much so that you have to know what's going to happen next. There's nothing worse than someone giving you a rave review of a book, and you start reading it and just it's like nothing happens, and they tell you, oh, you've just got to stick with it.
Yeah, there's nothing worse.
The story ramps up, and that's horrible. There's nothing worse than it's like when you're young and you try something and someone tells you, well, it's an acquired taste.
Quiet
Well,
taste.
yeah, who wants to suffer through until you acquire the taste? um so how do you think about beginnings, and when you first start brainstorming a story, does a hook for the beginning come to you? Like, how's that evolution work?
Yeah, I mean, it's so. if I'm starting a book, I've gone through. I mean, I kind of have a premise and a plot and all that, but then I do ask myself the question. It's just where there's a couple big questions always before you start your book. One is who is telling the story and why, and then where does the story begin? Um, and one of the um, things I try and remind myself, it's not always the case, but often the story should begin later than I think it should. Um, like sometimes books start too early. We can jump in. I mean, I think readers are smart people, and you don't need to um, set up. I mean, for example, I mean, I don't know if I ever considered this, but this book starts with this American student. She's already at the cusp of Christmas. Now, you could have started that with um, her arriving. You could talk about her semester. You could talk about um, the friends she's made, the friends she doesn't make, how she feels being an American in London. Um, but you don't. I mean, you don't need that. You can. You
Right.
should. I think it's important to have stuff happening um, when you start. So oftentimes, I think books are started. I have the tendency to start too early, so I just tell myself, no. Can I move the start time up? And I think, or back, or however you want to put it. But I think that's one way to think about it.
Are you ever concerned that the reader will fill in blanks on their own when you kind of drop them into a story, um, that, and make connections that you didn't want them to make, or do you just think as I unravel this story, the reader will follow along? Is that ever a concern?
No, because I think um, ultimately readers are always filling in blanks. I mean, unless you're like detailing every moment of some character's life, your readers are filling in blanks. So I think if you have a strong enough character, they won't misread them. Um, there's but I think that's why you need to start with something that's instantly recognizable, like um, in other words, like you could start with Ashley Smith, or what it feels like to be a student in London, but that's not so interesting. It's a little more interesting that she's not going home for Christmas because her parents are dead, and it's a little more interesting that some girl she didn't even know she was friends with suddenly invites her. So what you're starting with there are a couple questions, like what it's a little off, or whatever. Um, so I think you need to. I think you need to just trust that most people will fill in the rest, and get a sense of who she is. So I mean, that's how I think about it.
Your main protagonist, Ashley Smith, that you alluded to a second ago. Um, when you first started thinking about this sort of English Christmas mystery thriller, where did Ashley drop in along the way, and how, like, where did she come from? What was your creation process for her?
Well, I can't really speak too closely to it. I mean, in some ways, she came out a little bit of the plot. I mean, I definitely wanted. Um, I like. I mean, I like the sort of fish out of water story, and then I kind of, instead of making her, and it's a little bit plot based, but
Yeah,
she presents as sort of a ditzy American. She's from California. I don't write a lot of characters from California. She's maybe someone you would see. She would, you know, she talks too loud. She's probably looks a little dumber than she is. She's a sort of a bubblegum American in London, and as soon as I realized that she presents that way, it was really important that if we're going to be in her diary for a period of time, to see that like no anyone who presents that way, everyone has their interior life, and we learn more about her interior life, and she's not quite like that, but that was my original idea of what what she would look like from the outside world. Um, which we get a little bit of a look at her from the outside as well.
The shifting point of view of this novel, this novella, um, how did you come to the kind of the decisions about the way you would tell the story?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I sat down and wrote it fast, and I think um, it is one of those things where I did know. Um, let's just put it this way: I knew what the bad people. I had settled what the bad thing that was happening. I knew exactly what that was. So then it's just a matter of how do I tell that story to obscure it a little, and whose perspective should we tell that story from? And that's when I came up with this idea that we would get sort of half through the diary and half through a series of memories.
Well, it really works, and you said earlier about the kind of the necessity for this to be a shorter story, um, because of the type of story it was, and the way that you told it from the perspectives that you told it really enhance that and draw it out a little bit without it feeling contrived. Um, you could get right down to the heart of the matter, in maybe a 5,000 word short story,
Sure,
but
you could.
it's more fun to sort of draw it out like this, and but it doesn't feel drawn out. I think we've all read a novel that was maybe about 90 or 100,000 words, and by the end of it you're like, this really could have been 40,000 words. It's like
Right?
they just padded it just to bring the page count up,
Yeah.
and it does not feel that way. It feels like it's uh drawn out in the best way possible. Were you thinking about, ways that you could present the story so that you kind of amp up the mystery part of it while also keeping the kind of fast paced tension that you get from a novella?
Well, it's always tough. I mean, when you're thinking about who's telling the story, um, it's all about when you reveal certain information. And oftentimes in my books in the past, and you'll know this, like I'll just give up who the murderer is and who they murdered in chapter one. Like sometimes I think that's fine. Because sometimes to me the process is more interesting. But then I thought, you know, um, I love the idea that um, Ashley in her diary writing has a bit of an imagination, like everyone, but she is kind of often speculates on what kind of story she's in because she's developed a crush at this house. And is she in a love story? You know, it's kind of like, um,
Right.
so that as things sort of get stranger, she starts amending her idea of what story she's in. So I think that's, and I was hoping to kind of, I mean, you're trying to kind of obscure what's really going on as the writer, and that I was able to do that because I was able to just slip into entirely her point of view, um, to the point where it's through a diary, so it's very filtered through her own sensibilities and brain and perceptions of what's happening around her.
Yeah. How did fitting in the Christmas guest affect your work schedule? For years now, you've been kind of on a typical production schedule, one big book a year, and then the publicity and all of that comes with that. Um, I would imagine that you have fallen into a bit of a rhythm with the the writing, side, the publishing side, the promotion. I would imagine your year kind of falls out to support all those things. How did wedging in this new project affect um your typical creative life?
it didn't necessarily slow down me producing a next novel, although the big changes. So for the first time ever, this coming year, it was 2024. I would typically have a book coming out usually around March.
Yeah.
I do have a new book coming out, but that's coming out in June. So that's the first time I've ever done that time period for a book coming out. So that did get pushed back a little. I was happy about that just because I wanted there to be a little bit of a break um, between promotions, but it also worked out well because I think maybe I was a little later. I might have been a little later with this book coming in, the new book. So um, yeah, I mean, I was happy to do something else, but yeah, I was like, as much as I mean, I love writing a book a year, but sometimes um, doing the promotions around a book every year is the harder part for me. Um, but the but writing it isn't. I love to write, so
Yeah. So I'm hearing that we'll have a new book next summer. Can
that's
you
the
tell us
plan.
anything about it?
Yeah, so it's not a sequel, but it includes the character of Lily Kintner again, um, and it's I will say only this, that it's kind of I think it's my first full on kind of serial killer novel in a sense. Um, and because I can't, the story began, it didn't begin with Lily, although Lily got brought in. It began with an idea of a serial killer who I think is quite different than other serial killers we've seen. Um, and I wanted to write about him and then kind of conceived of a cat and mouse game between him and Lily Kintner, who's the character in Kind Worth Killing and also the Kind Worth Saving.
I find it very interesting that we're going to see Lily again. This is the third book that we're going to see her. This is for someone who's written standalones with the exception of The Kind Worth Saving, which was a follow on from the kind worth killing. Um, do you like having these characters that you've developed a bit of a relationship with, for lack of a better term? Is it more fun to kind of continue these stories and imagine where these characters have been and where they're going to continue to go?
Well, it's been fun with Lily because I really like writing her, and I think she's a unique person because she essentially becomes the protagonist of the story, despite the fact that she's a kind of a murderous person herself. So she's sort of an anti-hero, a good girl, bad girl type of thing. But
Yeah.
but what's fun with that is she's sort of a detective. In this book, she kind of becomes a detective figure, kind of tracking down another killer. And of course, you get the fun of what will eventually happen with when the two of them meet. Um, but yeah, I think I just really like writing her. I like writing her world. This was another book that she fit into really nicely. The next book I'm gonna is not gonna contain have her in it. So I'll see if she shows up again. But I mean, for right now, I did enjoy putting her in a third book, and then I'm definitely going to go back to standalones. I think for a couple.
I love it. Well, the Christmas guest, excuse me, is available everywhere now. Go visit your local bookstore, grab a stack of these, and use them as stocking stuffers this year. They would be fantastic for that. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we're going to include an Amazon link where you can grab it. It's available in Kindle edition or hardcover or audiobook. I've not listened to the audiobook yet, Peter, and I always listen to your audios. How's the production on this one?
Um, I'm afraid to say I do not know. I have not listened to it myself, and I know it was I think had some challenges around doing it in audio, but I have not heard it myself.
Like, well, we'll put a link
I
in there.
rarely
So
do. I don't
yeah,
like to listen to my words. I don't know what it is. It's just I suspect there are some authors out there who love listening to audiobooks of their books. Me, I avoid it.
Well, the vast majority of the folks I know can't stand to listen to their own words, so
Yeah, that's
I
how I feel.
totally understand that. There's just something weird about having someone read your voice back to you that's a little unsettling, I think.
Yeah,
The Christmas guest available everywhere now. Go grab it. Peter, your website is
correct.
peter-swanson.com. Is that right?
Peter-Swanson.com, and that'll link you up. It can get you to Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all those things.
Excellent.
Twitter,
Well,
X,
look,
whatever you want to call it.
yeah, whatever it is this week.
Right.
We'll link that up as well to make it easier for folks to find you. Peter, always a joy to catch up. Love the new book. We're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of it.
Thank you,
Thanks
Hank.
for joining
Always a
me today.
pleasure.